For a president on the way to give a State of the Union address, this was not a great headline for that day. Quote, Atlanta Fed shock sounds Trump session warning. The Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta forecasting yesterday that the U.S. economy, American GDP, is shrinking right now at an annualized rate of 2.8%, minus 2.8%. Now, that is just one forecast. It's an early forecast. But, you know, Trump session is not a great headline for a President Trump on the day of his first big speech. But here's another one from today, the morning after his big speech. Quote, private employers added just 77,000 jobs in February, far below expectations. And again, this is just a forecast, in this case from private industry. We don't get official hiring numbers until the monthly official jobs report comes out the day after tomorrow. But 77,000 is less than half the new jobs that were created last month, and it's half of what Wall Street has been expecting. It's all very worrying economic news, and it comes on top of Wall Street posting its worst loss of the year this week on Monday, when Trump announced that he was going through with his tariff plan on Canada and Mexico and China. Some of those losses in the markets were regained today after Trump had second thoughts and walked some of that back. But barely 6 weeks into this second Trump presidential term, economic indicators are blinking red in response to Trump's action as president. But, you know, they're called economic indicators for a reason. Measurements like these, measurements like the jobs report and GDP and economic growth and all these things, they're supposed to indicate what is going on in the economy. They're supposed to help the public and businesses and policymakers understand what is happening with the economy. What if they could just change those indicators, though? Turn the lights off so they didn't blink at all, red or otherwise. What if they could just change what these numbers mean and whether they indicate anything real about the economy? When I said at the top of the show I had a big warning for you, this is what it's about. Over the weekend on Fox News, Trump's newly appointed Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, floated the idea of changing the way we calculate GDP in this country. Lutnick says he wants to take government spending out of the equation. Just take that out and say that's not part of it, which would, of course, obscure the effects of everything Trump does in government, let alone his top campaign donor who's given free rein to do whatever he wants to the government. It also turns out Elon Musk, the president's top campaign donor, is into this idea. On Friday, he himself posted online that we should change the way we calculate America's economic growth, America's GDP. Never mind the pesky concerns of economists about interference in the federal data. We should just calculate it in a different way, a better way, a way that suits them better. In the category of watching what they do and not what they say, though, here's something that Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has just done. The Wall Street Journal was first to report that Secretary Lutnick has now disbanded 2 advisory committees whose job it is to make sure that the economic data from the federal government are accurate. An expert who worked on one of those now disbanded committees tells the Wall Street Journal that their work, quote, goes to the essential transparency of these statistical agencies. When you remove that transparency, then that diminishes trust. Already just 6 weeks in, Trump has taken a number of actions that have potentially disastrous economic consequences in this country, and in many ways, the country is already feeling it. If they are going to cook the books so that economic indicators like unemployment numbers and economic growth and whether or not we're in a recession or a depression just don't mean anything anymore because they've recalculated them with special Trump numbers, what does that mean for our ability to know the truth about what's going on, and what does it mean for us economically?
How worried should we be about an economy that is slowing in all of this? We saw the GDP last week. Are any of these moves worrying you that we're actually going to see it cut into growth over the near term negatively?
No. So let's The Commerce Department runs the statistics of GDP. They count government spending as part of GDP. So I'm going to separate those two and make it transparent.
Donald Trump's Commerce Secretary asked on Fox News about worrisome new economic indicators, and his response is, don't worry, I control the statistics. I'm going to change those. Joining us now is Jared Bernstein, who was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Joe Biden. Mr. Bernstein, it is nice to see you. Thank you for being here.
A pleasure to be with you.
Is it possible to change the basic statistics we have for the U.S. economy? And what would be the consequences if those data are no longer considered reliable?
Well, it would be possible to do if you took over agencies that would resist you very, very strongly. Some of the most, our agencies, our statistical agencies are staffed by people with tremendous integrity who would fight as hard as they could. But we've seen some of the tactics that this administration uses against such folks. So, of course, it's worrisome. And the consequences, well, you partially outlined them earlier yourself, Rachel, and you were spot on. If you're an investor, a global investor, trying to figure out where our economy is going. If you're a student thinking about an occupation where you might be needed in the future, if you're a local town trying to think about your infrastructure, think about all the trade data we've been talking about over the past few days with that other problem that's going on over there with this budding trade war. All of that information is essential to not just, number crunching nerds like myself, but to the well-being of markets, the country and the people in it. So these folks are, really playing with fire when they suggest manipulating the numbers like that.
The Federal Economic Statistics Advisory Committee, the Bureau of Economic Analysis Advisory Committee, those are impressively boring titles, Jared.
True.
But why would you want to get rid of those things? What is it that entities like that do that the Trump administration might want to do away with? Mr. Lutnick has gotten away with has done away with those committees as of today.
Really important question, because I think once you start thinking about that, you can get worried pretty quickly. First of all, let's be very clear that these committees are typically staffed by volunteers. They cost virtually nothing to run. And for 2 decades, they've been advising our statistical agencies on making their good work even better, improving transparency. And all I can think about is an old adage that says, if you want to control the numbers or the information flow, first get rid of the experts. I have a hard time figuring out why you would chop away at an institution like that again, is virtually costless and provides essential information to keep improving an already really, excellent statistical system. So I don't like what I'm seeing here one bit.
Jared Bernstein, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Joe Biden. Jared, if it is what it seems like it's going to be, I have a feeling we're going to be talking to you about this a lot in the next few days. So stand by, my friend. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you.
President Trump is losing in a major way at the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. He is facing what is a blow to one of the strategies that I've told you about, that we've been documenting, how they want to, from the White House, get some of these cases up to the court. But this conservative-leaning Supreme Court is rejecting one of those bids. This is not the final act, but it is a huge, important, key step, and a step that Trump lost. He basically wanted the court to side with him in a bid to defund and go after these USAID contractors. The move comes just about 12 hours after key parts of the address. So I'm going to show you how this went, because some of what the president said last night was false, just simple lies. Some of it was hopeful, meaning things that he, like any president, might want to achieve, and trying to tell the nation about that. And then some of it was proven false, because the president made claims about things he's doing in this joint sort of congressional press address, right, pressing his case to the whole country as they watch. But he was basically bragging about things he says he has done, which by the next morning, the court said, no, you haven't.
Upon taking office, I imposed an immediate freeze on all federal hiring, a freeze on all new federal regulations, and a freeze on all foreign aid.
The Supreme Court rejected the Trump administration's effort to freeze nearly $2 billion in foreign aid.
Yes, he tried the freeze. Yes, he said it. And by the next morning, that was the breaking news. The courts stopped it. And this is something that is a larger problem for Donald Trump for the reasons we've told you about, that he is deliberately, repeatedly going beyond precedent, the law, what courts have ruled in the past, and seeing if he can get away with it. And on this one, he's not getting away with it. There are more than one set of rulings. A lot of them start at the lower courts, as you probably know. We've covered all this. But this is the first major ruling that goes against the defunding plans. And it is a signal that while this, as I've mentioned, is not the final step in the case, right? You start with basically the early steps, and then the White House has tried to, when they've lost, appeal that to the Supreme Court, saying, we know we're losing, but please help us. And so this morning, the Supreme Court said, no, we're not helping you get out of this early jam, and you can't just defund, at least this way. The ruling was 5-4. And so that also gives us new information in this second Trump term, because we've got these justices, including the ones he put on the court. And so what you see here against Trump on this case, right, is a working majority of 5 justices. And I'm going to leave this up for you because we could be following this for at least the next several years. This could be the coalition that sometimes says no to Trump, even though you see Barrett on there as a Trump appointee and you see Chief Justice Roberts, a Republican appointee. What you also see here is why the White House has this strategy, because they already have 4 votes for something like this, right? They narrowly lost, but they have 4 votes basically willing to go along with the rewriting of how funding and the power of the purse and congressional norms that go back 100 years. So you see those 5 going against the president. You see the 4, and we could see this coalition and this breakdown in the future. Roberts and Barrett also joined the liberal justices in that January ruling, which was a different topic. But again, if you cleave it on the line of just doing whatever Donald Trump demands or not, they said that sentencing in New York could go forward while he had those other justices siding with him. So this is a split. This is one of the battle lines that people follow. And remember, Donald Trump has pursued power in very aggressive ways that tested our system. And sometimes he lost, and sometimes the Supreme Court bailed him out. But other presidents have done this too. I'm not saying he's anything like FDR or Harry Truman. If you talk to historians and people who study this stuff, those are some of the high point presidencies for foreign policy and leading America. But there were big cases that you read about in law school about testing powers, which meant that the era of those different presidents was also tested by the era of those Supreme Courts. And we're seeing that replay now. And if everything I'm telling you sounds a little bit legal, a little bit in the weeds, I promise you I'm not just emphasizing this because I'm MSNBC's legal correspondent, because I'm a lawyer. I'm emphasizing this because when presidents test power, it is first and foremost the Supreme Court that is that block. We can debate whether members of Congress should yell more or less or hold up different paddles. People were talking about that last night. But it is always in our system of government the Supreme Court that matters most in quickly, before even a next election, saying no if you've exceeded authority. So this ruling today is important. It was concise and to the point. We know about the split because there was a dissent, but the unsigned majority ruling said this effort by Trump was denied. And then it had some legalese about saying the lower court ruling, which it was leaving in place after denying Trump's application, would still have to deal with the details of how to pause or slow down these efforts to defund things that Trump doesn't like. The reason why that's a big deal is if Congress funds it, then in most cases the president can't just cancel it after the funding law is passed. Supreme Court reporter Nina Totenberg also noted that the way this was done seemed unusual. The court majority basically said, if you dot your I's and cross your T's, we've got your back. Justice Alito had that dissent, which showed the 4 that I showed you, the 4 justices who wanted to do what Trump wanted. And he argued that a single district court judge should not have unchecked power to make the government pay basically the agreements it's agreed to. And then he threw in his own little kind of personal emotion. He is stunned. I am stunned, Alito says. Now, that's a reminder of how Justice Alito and certain members of the court have really given up any pretense of just hewing to the law and saying this fits our precedent or this doesn't, because when you say you're stunned, you're just sharing your emotions based on what your preconceptions were. I guess he thought there would be at least one extra vote, and he is stunned that there's not. But for him being an important member of the Supreme Court, if any other lawyer said that, you'd go, well, that sounds like a you problem, that the events on the court aren't matching the perceptions and expectations you had, and you feel stunned. Now, the context for this is a series of lower court losses. And we've been tracking this for you as the White House and President Trump test power even more than in the first term and basically dare the courts to do something about it. And we've seen 5 blows and 1 win this week alone. So we put that up here. Again, we're not going to go through every one of these, but we are tracking them for you, and we will bring you the key ones and the highlights. The SCOTUS, of course, at the highest court in the land being the most important. Supreme Court justices rejecting that foreign aid freeze. You also have the bid to slash funding for health and basically related research. A judge blocked that just today, separate case. Another court gave Trump a new victory, rejecting New York City's bid to get $80 million in FEMA aid back. And a judge just yesterday ruling Trump cannot legally fire federal workers on this board chair position, at least without cause. In other words, the rules and laws still matter. There's also been blocking of health care and other issues. This has been a rough week overall. It is, of course, the 6th of Trump's term. Several other setbacks include Musk's attempt to get data blocked, an appeals court maintaining a blockage on what I told you was never going to fly, which was Trump trying to rewrite the Constitution's citizenship rules. And when you take it together, if you think about what's happening, they are doing what Steve Bannon once talked about. They are flooding the zone. You don't have to read all of this again. I'm just doing something we rarely do, which is combine a bunch of graphics to show you they are throwing a bunch of stuff out there. But if you let your eyes just sort of glaze over all the red X's, you are seeing just how many of them are being blocked in various ways. And there are 90-plus lawsuits now. Some of this is happening in parts of the country and through efforts that you're not always going to see, even if we try to keep track of it in general, but it shows you where the fault lines are. Trump is losing at the highest court in the land, and many of the other efforts are running into checkpoints, those red X's or setbacks or freezes, even as many Americans tuned in and heard the president talk about this as if it was all going just according to plan, or as if things that were frozen and paused and might never happen are definitely going to happen.
I think that's correct, but I think that there's a longer run that Roberts has in mind, and that is that he doesn't want the court to look like hacks doing the bidding of a president who either supports them or nominated them to the bench. And I think Barrett must agree with that as well. And so now we have a couple of data points in that direction, so that the trust of Americans is dependent upon the perception of the court. And that's the way I see this decision. And it was a loss to Trump, but it was also important to note that when the per curiam was issued, they talked about the fact that Trump and company were acknowledging the order of the court, as opposed to, say, an Andrew Jackson thing in which they would just say, well, let them enforce it. That has not happened. So there are two things going on, and I hope and expect that we're going to see more of the same as necessary. And if I may add one other thing, I think if you read the dissent, which is 8 pages, by Alito, imagine if you're trying to sell that to Roberts or to Barrett, which is what happens when they're figuring out who is going to issue a decision and what it's going to say. And the Chief Justice always gets to assign if he's on the side that voted for the proposition. And I think if any of the judges of the 5 would have a lot of trouble adopting Alito, putting aside the question of stunning. So that's my first observation about it.
4 months. That is how long Ukraine can resist Russian forces without support from the United States. That's according to one alarming estimate in the New York Times today, a dire picture for an ally that the Trump administration appears intent on weakening ahead of any negotiations with Vladimir Putin. One defense official tells NBC News that arms shipments to Ukraine this week were halted in their tracks. The planes were turned back when the Trump administration decided to stop arming Ukraine. On top of that, news this morning that the Trump administration has stopped sharing intelligence with Ukraine as well. Here's National Security Advisor Mike Waltz.
Did the U.S. pause intelligence sharing with Ukraine, and is it still paused right now?
We have taken a step back and are pausing and reviewing all aspects of this relationship.
Donald Trump's CIA Director John Ratcliffe adds that that pause will, quote, go away, but it's unclear at what moment exactly it will take for our intelligence sharing to ever resume. At this moment, the Trump administration may have dealt a significant blow to Ukraine's ability to fight the Russians. The New York Times reported last year that, quote, the intelligence partnership between Washington and Kyiv is a linchpin of Ukraine's ability to defend itself. The CIA and other American intelligence agencies provide intelligence for targeted missile strikes. They track Russian troop movements and help support spy networks. The relationship is so ingrained that CIA officers remained at a remote location in western Ukraine when the Biden administration evacuated U.S. personnel in the weeks before Russia invaded in February 2022. During the invasion, the officers relayed critical intelligence, including where Russia was planning strikes and which weapon systems they would use. And both countries benefit. This is important. The New York Times adds this about the intelligence sharing between the U.S. and Ukraine. Quote, it took root a decade ago, coming together in fits and starts under three very different U.S. presidents, pushed forward by key individuals who often took daring risks. It has transformed Ukraine, whose intelligence agencies were long seen as thoroughly compromised by Russia, into one of Washington's most important intelligence partners against the Kremlin today. The end of intelligence sharing begs the question, why? Why would the Trump administration no longer need or value or want a relationship that yields valuable intelligence from Ukraine against the Kremlin? All aid to Ukraine has been stopped even after Trump revealed that President Zelensky had reached out to him in a letter saying he was ready to sign a mineral deal and pursue peace talks. One former Biden administration telling the New York Times this, quote, halting security assistance will only make it more challenging for Ukraine to reach a just and lasting end to this war. It will reduce Ukraine's leverage, weaken the Ukrainian military, and therefore undermine Ukraine's negotiating position with Russia. The United States should be focused on strengthening, not weakening, Ukraine's hand ahead of a negotiation. That is where we start today with some of our favorite experts and friends. New York Times national security reporter Julian Barnes is here. Also joining us, former CIA director, now national security analyst John Brennan's here. And with me at the table for the hour, founder and CEO of the Independent Veterans of America, co-founder of American Veterans for Ukraine, Paul Rieckhoff's here. Julian, take me through the reporting.
So we've known for all of this week that President Trump, ever since that Oval Office confrontation between President Trump, Vice President Vance, and President Zelensky of Ukraine, we've known that the White House has been angry with Zelensky, has been wanting to pressure him. And so first came the word that they were cutting off the military aid. And then today we had John Ratcliffe, Mike Waltz saying that they'd cut off the intelligence partnership. There had been some doubt. Some officials wanted to gradually ratchet up the pressure. Others just wanted more out of Zelensky. I mean, but make no mistake, this is the Trump administration pressuring the Ukrainians to agree to their terms on the minerals deal, on their approach to peace, which is different than the European approach, which is different than the Ukrainian approach.
Director Brennan, what is the consequence for Ukraine's ability to prevail or to continue to fight?
It's potentially devastating. U.S. support to Ukraine to confront Russian aggression has many different components to it. There are the weapons, there's the munitions, There's the logistical support and the technical systems that empower those capabilities. There's also military advice and guidance. And then there's intelligence. Intelligence is the lifeblood that gives all of those other components the capability to push back against the Russians. And so if you take away the intelligence, you're making the weapons, the capabilities, the munitions, technical systems, and other types of things enfeebled by taking that away. And so over the past, over a decade, the United States has been providing support to Ukraine to be able to build up its capabilities, but to, again, infuse their capabilities with the intelligence that we're able to obtain. And I must point out, this is not a one-way street. Over the past decade, the Ukrainians have provided a lot of intelligence to us, giving us insights about what Russian capabilities are. And so therefore, this extortionist approach to trying to get Zelensky to basically fold to the Trump administration's, wishes as far as some type of peace arrangement that looks more like a surrender, the way that Trump is talking about Putin and Russia. This using intelligence as that lever really is unconscionable. It's appalling. It's not surprising, though, in light of the fact that this is what the Trump administration does by threatening, by intimidating, but now also taking action to take away that intelligence feed that the Ukrainians rely on so heavily.
John, can the Europeans replace or fill the gap, or is the American intelligence product the more superior asset for a country like Ukraine at war with Russia?
Well, the U.S. intelligence community has by far the greatest capabilities, the most extensive and in-depth and accurate intelligence that's provided to the Ukrainians. Now, our NATO partners and other European countries provide intelligence to the Ukrainians, but it falls far short of what the United States is able to provide, because we are basically, again, the leading intelligence community. And therefore, I think the Europeans will try to make up some. They can make up some. But if you pull out the plug of U.S. intelligence, it's going to make a lot of these capabilities and systems go dark. It's not going to allow the Ukrainians to know the next Russian military operation or drone strike or missile strike. It's going to lead to civilian deaths. It's going to lead to more casualties on the part of the Ukrainians, because it's the Ukrainian military that relies on that intelligence to be able to allow it to understand how to confront and deal and counter the next wave of Russian aggression.
I mean, Julian, how does the CIA simply turn off an alliance like this on the battlefield in terms of intelligence?
I mean, that is a great question. It's really hard, right? This is relationships. This is relationships that CIA officers have built up over months with Ukrainians, that the Ukrainian intelligence officers that they know well, that they trust, that they have trained up, right? This kind of order is really hard for an average intelligence officer to take. Like, they have been part of this war. They have been very much helping the Ukrainians in their successes, helping the Ukrainians in their defenses. Now, to be fair, they haven't just been providing intelligence. They've also been training the Ukrainians about using intelligence, gathering intelligence. So the Ukrainians are in a much better position today to use what Europe has given them, to use what they can collect themselves. Now, nothing is going to, as John pointed out, replace America's network of satellites, signals intelligence, human networks. But they have been trained well, but you're right, this is going to be enormously difficult. And I think a lot of CIA officers are likely hoping that this is only a temporary pause, that something happens to turn on the intelligence sharing again. Though, we do not know exactly what the Trump administration will ask of the Ukrainians to make that happen.
I want to start with Donald Trump's tariffs, what he said in his joint address last night, just a little more than 24 hours ago.
Tariffs. It's a beautiful word, isn't it? That, along with our other policies, will allow our auto industry to absolutely boom. It's going to boom. Spoke to the majors today, all three, the top people, and they're so excited.
So excited. Tariffs are going to help the auto industry so much. He knew it wasn't true then. We had already heard from Ford CEO saying it was going to blow a hole in the industry. And here we are 24 later, exemption time.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I will say it took longer this time to walk back the tariffs than it did last time. I mean, if you remember, like just a month ago, if people are having a hard time keeping track, early February, he said on like a Saturday he was going to put them in place on Tuesday, and then by Monday mid-morning they were called off. During his first term, he had threatened to put tariffs on Mexico. Then a few weeks before those were supposed to go into effect, he called them off. I mean, if you're starting to see a pattern, so am I, about how these tariffs work. But I mean, the one thing that does remain consistent is this administration continues to talk about tariffs in one form or another. They have been very consistent so far with the tariffs on China, but those ones did actually go in place, a 10% tariff a month ago. Just the other day, they added to that. So those tariffs are now 20%. So it's not insignificant. And even this latest walk back with the auto industry, yes, that's a big lifesaver, at least for the next month, for the auto industry and all the industries that are dependent on that, like the suppliers in Michigan and Ohio. But that doesn't do anything for appliances, electronics coming from Mexico, produce, avocados, berries, tomatoes, not to mention tequila, beer, and then energy products, for example, coming in from Canada. So even though there's a bit of a reprieve here, the effects are still going to be really widely felt across the economy.
Okay, but let's just stay with the auto industry, because the press secretary said during this month, what these automakers can do is sort of re-rack their manufacturing so they can start shifting things that happen in Canada and Mexico to the United States. Like, let's get real. There are not empty factories owned by Ford and GM ready to produce certain parts with auto workers ready to do it. Like, this isn't even possible. What are they talking about?
Well, I talked to a former industry analyst and someone who had worked in the industry as a sort of a buyer on the manufacturing side, and I was asking him about that. I was saying, well, can you just throw a second or third shift on the Silverado plant in the U.S. and start making them there instead of Canada? And he said, no, it's not that easy. Each plant is specifically tailored to make a very specific vehicle. If you want to change that, you need new equipment, you need to reconfigure the plant, you need additional workers, you need to find those workers, you need to train them, you need to, not to mention, pay them higher wages and health care than you do in Canada or Mexico, which is an added cost for companies. Despite the White House acting like this is something the companies can shift over in a few months, the auto industry plans out in years, like 4 years, 10 years, for where their production is going to be, what that's going to look like. And so if they're going to do this, not only is it going to take time, but it's also going to take a lot of money, a big investment. And these companies already operate on relatively thin margins. They're not starving here, but they are on a bit of a tight margin. Prices are very important to consumers, so they're very sensitive to price any increase. So making that big investment is going to add to higher costs ultimately for consumers.
David, we understand the idea behind why they would want to impose tariffs on something like China. But let's go back to Canada and Mexico, because Howard Lutnick said, listen, the president just needs them to meet in the middle. But the president again today said Canada's efforts on fentanyl were just not good enough. Let's level set. There is not a massive amount of fentanyl coming from Canada to the United States. What is this?
And
what's going to be good enough?
And Donald Trump doesn't care about the proliferation of drugs, because he just pardoned the Silk Road founder and operator. So this is not about drugs. And I think we have to just recognize Donald Trump has no idea what he's doing. None whatsoever when it comes to tariffs. And poor Howard Lutnick, bless his heart, has his head on a swivel every time he steps in front of the media, because he doesn't know what he's defending. And I think what we saw last night at the State of the Union was Donald Trump saying, with all of his showmanship, tariffs are great. They make America great. They give us a strong economy. Well, if tariffs are great, then why are we providing exemptions for them? Think about it. I mean, if truly his economic theory is tariffs make America great, then why are we coming up with exemptions and changing our mind all the time? And it's because he doesn't actually know what he's doing. We've had this conversation before. Everyone knows this. If you want to reposition the domestic economy into a certain sector, tariffs can be a tool of that, one tool of a broader package. And in fact, you don't do the tariffs by presidential declaration. You typically would do it through a massive legislative package that recognizes we want to turn the U.S. economy in a certain direction.
But David,
that
we're
is
not
Donald
even a
Trump.
manufacturing-based economy anymore. Decades and decades ago, right? 50% of our economy was manufacturing. It's less than 10% now, and that's not going to change. We're a service-based economy.
Which exposes Donald Trump's ignorance, right? We started this pivot from manufacturing to service in the 90s because arguably we were getting outcompeted in manufacturing anyway. It was a massive pivot with significant job losses, hurt to industry, hurt to employees, but we did it. We got to cheap goods and decided a service-based economy is going to grow the American economy. Donald Trump thinks perhaps manufacturing will do it, but he thinks a declaration of a tariff is going to reignite the auto industry in the country, and it's not going to do it. And he cannot do this in a way that the likes of our own Secretary of Commerce know how to justify. And there is an absurdity to this. But look, he is going to break this economy with the direction he's going currently. And the only chance Donald Trump and Republicans have for a political fortune in the next 2 years is a white-hot economy. He's making sure we don't have one.
Jessica, last night he said this is great for farmers. He said farmers have fun with this idea they'd have less competition. Yes, they'd have less international competition, but we produce more food in the United States than we can consume. We need to export. And now CNBC is reporting they're now weighing agricultural exemptions. Was this thing always about exemptions? Because this is the one tool Donald Trump has where he can actually choose winners and losers. And when you come to him and say, I'm going to need that exemption, sir, he can decide if you get it.
Exactly. It gives him absolute power, where people who have access to him, who somehow pay for access to him or are connected to members who are close to him, get what they're asking for. It's based on the whim of Donald Trump. And there are few reporters who understand as well as you, Stephanie, that there's something that business likes, which is consistency, predictability from government. This abolishes that. It's bad for consumers. It's bad for farmers. It's bad for business. It kind of reflects the fact that Donald Trump somehow is stuck in the 80s when there was a manufacturing economy, when, you know, Sylvester Stallone was a hero in American cinema.
Okay, let's be clear. The 80s are his favorite decade. Right? Stretch limos. I mean, that's his jam.
I mean, he's got the haircut.
Yeah, it's actually the 1880s. Like, let's be clear, he's quoting William McKinley.
No, that's just his policy on race.
Yes.
I don't think he knew what
But
that
is
was.
there any chance? Let's open our hearts and minds. Any chance it works? Any chance this is short-term pain, this is negotiating? Because let's be clear, we do have a stronger hand than Canada or Mexico.
Well, it's not going to work. I was in Mexico last week. I met one day with 8 CEOs from various industries, CEOs, and half of them were CEOs of U.S. companies. I think about a third of the exports from Mexico to the U.S. come from companies that are U.S. owned. You look at a company like Walmart, 80% of the products that fill its shelves come from Mexico. And all of these gentlemen were completely dumbfounded as to why Trump was pursuing this, because they don't see it as a trading relationship. It actually isn't a trading relationship like we have with China. It is this deeply intertwined production partnership. And it's up and down the supply chain on automobiles. It's in electronics, agriculture. You can just go on down the line. And Trump is simply shooting the U.S. economy in the foot for the sake of performance. And what he's trying to perform is he's trying to deliver on a campaign promise that he's on the side of the American worker, who is part of this odd coalition of voters he's put together. And the people who are most fervently in his corner among working class voters are displaced manufacturing workers or rural voters, all of who have been deeply brutalized by this shift into a service and a technology economy from a manufacturing economy.
But that's not going to mean a manufacturing plant is going to open up in Sandusky, Ohio
what he needs
tomorrow.
to do is show to them he's trying to do that. And on his way to performing this act of rescuing those people, he is unwinding economic partnerships that are vital to the American economy. And part of this for him is the pain is the point. He's not. He isn't that concerned ultimately about the outcome. He wants Canada to kiss the ring. He wants Mexico to kiss the ring. He's not going to get affected personally by the China breaking. And then when you get Howard Lutnick, I have a little different view of the bless Howard Lutnick's heart, because I actually think he's an accomplice in this. He was on, I think, Bloomberg Radio.
I was being gracious.
Okay. He was on the radio this morning, ticking off these great deals that are happening now. TSMC, the Taiwanese chip makers, is putting in a $100 billion plant. Apple's putting in a plant, and he went through this list and he said, you now have over $1 trillion in investment. But meanwhile, while that is happening, they're sabotaging existing trade relationships that are worth way more than that.
Let's bring into the conversation Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. He's a member of the Foreign Relations and Budget Committees. The senator walked out of the chamber before the end of Trump's speech. Senator, good morning. So we don't know, was that a Joe Scarborough dip out to the cloakroom for a Mountain Dew, take a quick nap, and then come back in, or was that a form of protest last night?
No, I'd had enough. It was a long speech full of lies. I'd had enough after 5 seconds, but after an hour and whatever it was of avalanche of lies, I'd had enough. I went and brought a guest. I brought a guest. Her name is Skye Perryman. She heads up Democracy Forward, which is the tip of the spear in fighting back against these lies and illegal actions in court. So I'm glad I brought her along, because I think we need to focus on the big lies in the speech. And as you're talking about, all of you, the great betrayal. Donald Trump came in claiming he was going to focus on these pocketbook issues, bring down prices. What he's doing is cutting services for the American people and rigging the government for people like Elon Musk, and preparing for the big tax cuts, where he again lied by pretending they were going to help all Americans when they're going to help the very rich folks like Elon Musk.
Senator, you're on the Foreign Affairs Committee, so I'm fascinated what you think about what the president said about Ukraine last night. It seemed to be one bit of news that we actually got from the speech. But before you do that, I just want to read you what some of your Republican peers had to say yesterday about the president's recent actions on Ukraine. Senator Collins said, "I do not think we should be pausing our efforts in Ukraine." Ted Cruz said, "The war should come to an end in a way that is a clear and unequivocal loss for Russia and a loss for Putin." Senator Murkowski said, "I am sick to my stomach as the administration appears to be walking away from our allies and embracing Putin." Leader Thune said, "No question about who started the war. Russia is the aggressor here." Senator Tom Tillis, who is up for election next year, "President Putin is evil, and he has to be stopped." Louisiana Senator Kennedy, "To the extent that the White House has said Ukraine started the war, I disagree." Senator Kramer, "Trump is factually wrong to call Zelensky a dictator." Senator Rounds, "Clearly, Ukraine needs our support, and I think the vast majority of us are very supportive of Ukraine. They were the ones that were attacked." And then Bacon said, "Too bad Iran, North Korea, and China are not pausing their military aid and economic support." That is a long list of Republicans, Senator, that share your concern about Donald Trump cutting off aid to an ally who's been invaded by Russia.
Well, you're right, Joe. I'm glad to hear those statements, but we need more action out of our Republican Senate colleagues. So, for example, they have an opportunity to actually push back through the nominations process, right? Don't just clear all these people automatically while the president is engaged in this disgraceful bow down to Vladimir Putin and bullying people like Zelensky and our other allies, because I'd like to see them take more action. So, for example, just yesterday in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, we had the Trump ambassadorial nominee for NATO. And I asked him that simple question you raised: was Russia the aggressor against Ukraine? And he wouldn't answer the question. And neither would the other nominees. So because they all want to take the lead from the great leader, Donald Trump. And when Donald Trump says something, the reality is that everybody else gets a lobotomy. I mean, they can't think on their own. And, you know, with Secretary Rubio, you've got Elon Musk essentially having taken over the State Department, at least the effort to dismantle AID. So the reality is that we have a situation where everybody in the administration is in absolute lockstep with this disgraceful approach the president's taken. And of course, this time around, he learned not to nominate anybody who could think for themselves, right? I mean, this is a very different group of nominations that are coming before the United States Senate. They're all people who are going to, you know, at the end, obviously, his nominees and his folks will go with what the president says, but he doesn't want anybody pushing back in any way and raising the hard questions. He just wants the yes men and women, and that's a very, very dangerous thing for us.
Good morning, Chris. It's Claire. I know you're on budget. I have always been one that has said to everybody, don't worry, the government's not going to shut down. It is really bad form, the way we do it. We wait till the last minute. But this time, it feels like the government could shut down. I mean, we have 10 days. Republicans have the votes if they want to keep government open. How firm are the Democrats going to stand in not helping them in this crisis that they have brought upon America, both with their desire to make tax cuts for billionaires permanent and their failure to fund the government?
So, Claire, it's good to be with you, and you and Joe have been through these, joint sessions, and I think we would agree that none has been more awful than the one last night. But the other awful thing is what they're trying to do. So on the budget, we, of course, are going to do everything we can to fight their effort to provide tax cuts for the very wealthy and try to gut programs like Medicaid, because this is the great betrayal, right? I mean, Donald Trump is essentially screwing the people he said he wanted to help, and he's benefiting the people who are right behind him on Inauguration Day, people like Elon Musk. In terms of the appropriations, we don't want a government shutdown, but as you said, Republicans are in control here. And right now, some of them are talking about trying to essentially incorporate the Elon Musk so-called budget savings, which are big lies like the Social Security one, into their appropriations bill. And that will show us that they just want to shut down the government. So, look, we are willing to have bipartisan discussions and a do no harm approach, but we will not be complicit in anything that advances the Elon Musk effort, which is nothing about government efficiency, as you know, and everything about rigging the government for people like Elon Musk, who, by the way, got a couple more $1 billion worth of contracts in the last 10 days.
Yeah, there are the conflicts of interest, as we've been talking about. They're nibbling around the edges of trimming the budget when they're not going for the real sources of our debt and deficit. Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. Senator, thanks so much for your time this morning. We appreciate it.